She seemed like any other 12-year-old on the flight. No one paid attention to the quiet girl with her tablet and backpack. But when the plane faced disaster and military helicopters arrived, they spoke her name with such reverence that everyone realized the child they had overlooked was actually a legend. The girl in seat 14C looked like any other unaccompanied minor on Flight 2847 from Washington Dulles to San Diego. 12 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, she sat quietly with a tablet balanced on the tray table, occasionally glancing out the window at the clouds passing below. Her backpack, tucked under the seat in front of her, was decorated with the kind of colorful pins that middle school students collect, and her sneakers showed the worn patterns of someone who spent recess running around playgrounds rather than sitting still. The flight attendants had checked on her 3 times already during the first hour of the flight, each time speaking in that careful, encouraging voice adults use with children traveling alone. Sarah Mitchell, from the cabin crew, stopped by seat 14C again as they reached cruising altitude over the Midwest, offering the warm smile she reserved for the young passengers who needed extra attention. "How are you doing, sweetie?" she asked, leaning down to make eye contact with the girl. "Can I get you anything to drink? We have apple juice, orange juice, or soda, if that's okay with whoever is meeting you in San Diego." The girl looked up from her tablet, where she had been reading something that appeared to be a history textbook, her brown eyes serious and thoughtful. "Water is fine, thank you," she said politely, her voice quiet and measured. Sarah noticed the girl had been reading about World War II aircraft, probably for a school project, and felt a small surge of approval that kids these days still studied real books instead of just playing games. The passengers around her had barely registered her presence beyond the initial boarding, when she had walked past their seats with the airline escort who made sure unaccompanied minors found their assigned places. The businessman in 14A had glanced up from his laptop long enough to note she seemed well-behaved and unlikely to cause a disturbance during the 5-hour flight, then returned to his spreadsheets. The elderly couple across the aisle in 14D and 14E had smiled at her with the indulgent expressions grandparents give to all children, seeing nothing more than a youngster probably heading to visit family during school break. Nobody imagined that the quiet girl with the tablet and the worn backpack carried a name that would make hardened military operators straighten their spines and speak with immediate reverence. Her travel documents listed her simply as Emma Blackwood, age 12, traveling alone with permission and emergency contact information properly filed. The gate agents had processed her paperwork with the routine efficiency they applied to dozens of unaccompanied minors every day, making sure her wristband matched her boarding pass and that the flight crew knew she needed to be handed directly to her authorized guardian upon landing. The crew briefing had mentioned her only in passing, as one of 2 solo child passengers on the manifest, someone to keep comfortable and check on regularly, but nothing out of the ordinary for a Saturday afternoon flight across the country. Nobody had reason to recognize that the name Blackwood carried weight that extended far beyond what any 12-year-old should have to bear. Emma shifted in her seat and returned to her reading, her fingers tracing the text about aerial combat tactics with a familiarity that might have seemed unusual if anyone had been paying close enough attention. She had flown this route before, always alone, always quiet, always carrying books that most kids her age would find boring or too difficult. The truth was that she had been around aviation her entire life, had sat in cockpits before she could read, had listened to radio communications before she understood what the codes meant, and had learned the names of aircraft the way other children learned cartoon characters. But she never mentioned this to the flight attendants or the passengers who asked her friendly questions about school and hobbies, because explaining would require talking about things that still made her throat tight even 2 years later. 3 hours into the flight, somewhere over the Kansas plains, the first indication of trouble came when Captain David Morrison, in the cockpit, felt a sudden vibration through the control yoke that shouldn't have been there. His co-pilot, First Officer Jennifer Hayes, noticed it at the same moment, both of them exchanging the look that pilots give each other when something feels wrong, even before instruments confirm it. "You feel that?" Morrison asked, his hand steady on the controls, but his eyes already scanning the panel for warnings. Hayes nodded, her attention shifting to the engine readouts, where everything still showed normal. But the vibration continued, a subtle wrongness that experienced pilots recognize as the beginning of something worse. Within seconds, the wrongness became obvious as the number 2 engine's temperature gauge began climbing while its pressure dropped, the indicators moving in opposite directions, a sign of serious mechanical failure. Morrison's hand moved to the engine controls with practiced precision, following procedures burned into his memory through thousands of hours and countless simulations. But before he could begin the shutdown sequence, the cockpit filled with warnings. Multiple system failures cascaded across the panel, hydraulic pressure dropping, electrical buses showing faults, backup systems struggling to compensate for losses that shouldn't have been happening all at once. Hayes was already pulling the quick reference handbook, her voice steady as she read the emergency procedures, but both pilots knew they were facing something beyond standard failures. Mayday! 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 This is United 2847 Heavy. We have multiple engine and systems failures. Requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport, Morrison transmitted, his voice carrying the controlled urgency that comes from training designed to function under pressure. The response from Denver Center came back instantly, controllers already pulling up their screens to identify emergency landing options and clear airspace. United 2847, Denver Center. Roger your Mayday. Nearest suitable is Wichita Eisenhower, bearing 095, distance 83 miles. Clearing direct. Descend and maintain flight level 2550. In the cabin, passengers felt the aircraft shudder and begin descending, the change in engine tone audible even to those who had been sleeping or lost in their entertainment. Sarah Mitchell and the other flight attendants immediately began emergency preparation procedures, their movements efficient despite the fear that always came with knowing something serious was happening in the cockpit. Sarah moved through the aisle checking seatbelts and securing loose items, her training keeping her calm even as she wondered how bad it really was up front. When she reached row 14, she found Emma Blackwood sitting perfectly still, her hands folded on the tray table she had already locked in place, her seatbelt tight across her lap. The girl's face was calm, almost eerily composed for a 12-year-old during an obvious emergency. "We're going to be fine, honey," Sarah said, using the reassuring tone meant to comfort frightened passengers. "The pilots are just being extra careful, and we're going to land at a different airport. Nothing to worry about." Emma looked up at her and nodded, but Sarah saw something in those young eyes that didn't match the expected fear or confusion. Instead, the girl seemed focused, alert, almost analytical, as she listened to the sounds of the struggling aircraft. "I know," Emma said quietly. "The hydraulics are failing. They'll need to use alternate extension for the landing gear." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cabin temperature, wondering how a child knew what hydraulic failure sounded like. In the cockpit, Morrison and Hayes were discovering that their situation was worse than the initial failure suggested. The hydraulic systems that controlled the aircraft's flight surfaces were degrading faster than the procedures anticipated, making the plane increasingly difficult to handle. "We're losing authority," Hayes reported, her hands gripping the yoke as it became heavier and less responsive. Morrison was already calculating whether they could make Wichita or whether they needed somewhere closer, somewhere that could handle an emergency landing of a crippled wide-body aircraft with 187 souls aboard. "Denver, United 2847. We need immediate military assistance. Request any available assets for possible escort and crash response. Our controllability is rapidly degrading." The request for military assistance triggered protocols that existed precisely for situations like this, when civilian aircraft faced catastrophic failures that might require resources beyond what civilian airports could provide. At Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, alerts went out to standby crews, and within minutes 2 Black Hawk helicopters were being prepped for immediate launch. The Black Hawks weren't combat aircraft designed for escort duty, but they carried sophisticated communications equipment and medical personnel, and could provide aerial observation and coordination that might prove critical if the crippled airliner needed to attempt an off-airport landing. The crews scrambled with the speed that came from countless drills, pilots and medics running to their aircraft while ground crews cleared them for emergency departure. Major Alex Chen, pilot of the lead Black Hawk, was airborne 7 minutes after receiving the alert, his co-pilot, Captain Maria Santos, already coordinating with air traffic control to receive vectors toward the troubled airliner. In the back, their flight medic and rescue specialist were checking equipment and reviewing procedures for air-to-air coordination with civilian aircraft. Chen had flown support missions for aircraft emergencies before, though most had ended with successful landings, his role simply to observe and report. He listened to the frequency where United 2847 was communicating with controllers, hearing the professional calm in the pilot's voice that couldn't quite hide the severity of their situation. United 2847, this is Rescue 15. We're launching from Whiteman with 2 Black Hawks to provide support. Estimate intercept in 12 minutes. Morrison acknowledged the military assistance with relief that resources were being positioned, even though he hoped desperately they wouldn't be needed. He and Hayes were fighting the aircraft moment by moment, using everything they knew about flying wounded planes to keep it steady and descending toward Wichita. But the hydraulic failures continued to progress, and Morrison made the decision that he needed to inform the passengers about the seriousness of their situation. He picked up the PA handset, his voice steady and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison. As you're aware, we're experiencing technical difficulties with our aircraft. We have multiple system failures, and we're diverting to Wichita for an emergency landing. The aircraft is controllable, but we're preparing for the possibility of a hard landing. Flight attendants will instruct you on emergency procedures. We have military aircraft launching to assist us. Please remain calm and follow crew instructions." The cabin filled with the sound of worried voices and a few muffled cries as passengers processed what a hard landing meant. Sarah and her crew moved through the aisles, demonstrating brace positions and checking that everyone understood what might be coming. Emma Blackwood sat still in 14C, her hands now gripping the armrests, but her face composed. She had heard enough emergency briefings to understand what her grandfather and father had always said about staying calm during crisis situations, about thinking clearly when others panicked, about being the steady presence that helped others keep control. She closed her eyes and breathed slowly, the way she had been taught, and thought about the Black Hawks that were coming to help. Major Chen brought his Black Hawk into position 5 miles behind and 2,000 feet below the struggling United flight. His experienced eyes took in the way the aircraft was flying slightly nose up, wings not quite level, the visible signs of a plane being controlled with difficulty. His wingman, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Price, in the second Black Hawk, positioned on the opposite side, both helicopters maintaining safe distance while providing the visual observation that controllers and emergency responders on the ground needed. Chen's co-pilot, Santos, was coordinating with Wichita Tower and the emergency response teams being positioned around the airport, while simultaneously reviewing the passenger manifest that had been transmitted to them as part of the support protocol. Santos was scrolling through the list of names, cross-referencing against databases that flagged passengers who might require special consideration during emergencies, when she stopped suddenly and read a name twice to make sure she had it right. "Alex," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. "We have an Emma Blackwood on board. Age 12, traveling as an unaccompanied minor." Chen's head turned sharply toward her, his hands still steady on the controls, but his eyes questioning. "Blackwood, are you sure?" Santos nodded, already pulling up additional information that confirmed what the name meant. Granddaughter of Colonel Thomas Blackwood, daughter of Captain David Blackwood, that Blackwood. The frequency filled with a moment of absolute silence as Chen processed this information. Then he keyed his radio with a tone that carried weight beyond normal communications. All stations, this is Rescue 15. Be advised, passenger manifest includes Emma Blackwood. Confirm, the Blackwood. Repeat, we have the Blackwood family aboard." The effect was immediate and profound. In the second Black Hawk, Lieutenant Colonel Price felt her breath catch as she understood what Chen was saying. At Whiteman Air Force Base, the operations center went silent as controllers and commanders recognized a name that carried a legacy spanning 3 generations of extraordinary military sacrifice. At Wichita Tower, the controllers who had been managing the emergency with professional detachment suddenly felt the personal weight of protecting someone whose family had given everything for their country. Morrison heard the transmission in his cockpit and didn't understand its significance, focused as he was on keeping his aircraft flying, but the tone in the military pilot's voice told him something important had just been communicated. "Rescue 15, United 2847. Say again about passenger." Chen's voice came back with careful precision. "United 2847, we have confirmation that Emma Blackwood is aboard your aircraft. She is family of Colonel Thomas Blackwood and Captain David Blackwood. We are prioritizing all resources for your safe landing. Every asset we have is being positioned to assist you." In the cabin, Sarah Mitchell had returned to the forward galley, where she was coordinating with the other flight attendants, all of them trying to stay calm and focused. The senior attendant's phone buzzed with a message from the cockpit, and she read it twice, her face showing confusion. She looked at Sarah. "Did you know the child in 14C is someone important? The military is saying her name with some kind of special priority." Sarah thought about the quiet girl who had seemed too calm during the emergency, who had known about hydraulic failures. "What's her last name?" she asked. "Blackwood. Emma Blackwood." Why? Sarah felt something shift in her understanding as she remembered hearing that name before, in news stories from 2 years ago, stories about sacrifice and courage that had made the nation pause. Sarah walked back through the cabin to row 14, moving carefully as the aircraft continued its difficult descent toward Wichita. Emma was sitting exactly as before, calm and focused, but now Sarah looked at her differently. She knelt in the aisle beside the girl's seat, speaking quietly. "Emma, the military pilots know who you are. They're saying your name with a lot of respect. Is there something I should know?" Emma looked at the flight attendant, and for the first time her composure cracked slightly, tears forming in her eyes. "My grandfather was Colonel Thomas Blackwood. He died saving his crew when their helicopter was shot down in Afghanistan. My father was Captain David Blackwood. He died 2 years ago flying medical evacuation, when his plane crashed bringing wounded soldiers home. I'm going to San Diego to visit my grandmother. She's all I have left." The words hung in the air between them as Sarah understood why the military had reacted with such immediate reverence. The Blackwood name meant something in military circles because it represented a family that had given generation after generation to service, had sacrificed beyond what should ever be asked, had embodied the ideals that warriors held sacred. Colonel Thomas Blackwood had been legendary in Army aviation, a mentor to hundreds of pilots, a leader who had died shielding his crew with his own body during a crash landing under fire. Captain David Blackwood had followed his father into military aviation, flying medical missions that saved countless lives until the night his aircraft went down in a storm while carrying wounded Marines to emergency treatment, staying at the controls long enough for his crew to bail out before the plane hit the mountain. And Emma Blackwood, at 12 years old, had stood at Arlington National Cemetery twice, had received folded flags twice, had heard the 21-gun salute twice, and had learned what it meant to carry a name that others would honor for as long as anyone remembered what true sacrifice looked like. Sarah felt tears on her own cheeks as she took Emma's hand. "Your family must be so proud of you," she whispered. Emma nodded, using her free hand to wipe her eyes. "They taught me to be brave when things are scary, to stay calm and think clearly, to help others even when I'm afraid. That's what Blackwoods do." In the Black Hawk flying escort, Chen was coordinating with every available resource to ensure that Emma Blackwood's aircraft received every possible advantage for a safe landing. Additional emergency equipment was being positioned at Wichita, specialized crash response teams were being briefed, and medical helicopters were placed on standby. But beyond the logistics, something else was happening. Word was spreading through military channels that a Blackwood was aboard the troubled aircraft, and personnel were responding with a dedication that went beyond normal duty. Commanders were making calls to ensure nothing was overlooked. Specialists were reviewing procedures to identify anything that might help, because protecting Emma Blackwood meant honoring the memory of two heroes who had protected others at the cost of their own lives. Morrison was now 20 miles from Wichita, descending through 8,000 feet, and his aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control. The hydraulic systems were nearly gone, leaving him with minimal ability to maneuver. Hayes was reading procedures for manual gear extension, knowing they might need to land with the landing gear deployed using backup systems that were never meant to be primary. Morrison's hands were steady, but he was calculating the mathematics of a landing that would require precision he wasn't sure he could deliver with the degraded controls. He keyed the radio to the Black Hawks. "Rescue 15, United 2847. We're going to need all the help we can get. Can you provide visual confirmation of our gear extension when we deploy?" Chen acknowledged immediately. "United 2847, Rescue 15 will position for visual on your gear. We've got you." He maneuvered his Black Hawk to come underneath and slightly behind the airliner, positioning where he could see the landing gear doors when they opened. Lieutenant Colonel Price, in the second Black Hawk, moved to the opposite side to provide redundant observation. Morrison called for gear extension, and Hayes pulled the emergency lever that would use backup systems to lower the wheels. In the Black Hawks, crews watched as the doors opened and the massive landing gear began extending, the nose gear coming down, the main gear deploying from under the wings, but the left main gear didn't fully extend, stopping halfway down and refusing to lock into position. Chen's voice was calm but urgent. United 2847, Rescue 15, your left main gear is not fully extended, approximately half down. Unable to confirm locked indication. Morrison felt his stomach drop as he understood what this meant. Landing with one main gear not fully down would almost certainly result in the aircraft tipping to that side when the weight came onto the wheels, potentially causing the wing to strike the runway and triggering the catastrophic crash they were desperately trying to avoid. Hayes was already running through procedures to try to recycle the gear, but nothing was responding. In the cabin, Emma Blackwood heard the flight attendants preparing passengers for a crash landing, their voices professional but tight with fear. She thought about her grandfather, who had faced enemy fire without flinching, about her father, who had flown through storms to save wounded warriors. She thought about what they would do in this moment, and she realized that staying calm wasn't enough. Sometimes being a Blackwood meant taking action when others couldn't. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, ignoring Sarah Mitchell's immediate protest. "Emma, you need to sit down and stay buckled." But Emma was moving toward the forward galley with determined steps. "I need to talk to the pilots," Emma said firmly. "Right now. It's important." Sarah moved to block her, but something in the girl's voice and expression stopped her. "Emma, they're busy trying to save us. They can't be disturbed." Emma looked up at her with eyes that seemed older than 12. "My grandfather taught me about landing gear systems on cargo helicopters. My father taught me about emergency procedures on fixed-wing aircraft. I've been around aviation my whole life. I might know something that can help. Please." Sarah hesitated only a moment before picking up the phone to the cockpit, knowing it was against every protocol, but trusting that a girl carrying the Blackwood name wouldn't ask unless it mattered. Morrison answered the intercom with barely controlled frustration at being interrupted during the crisis. "What is it?" Sarah's voice was apologetic but firm. "Captain, the 12-year-old in 14C is Emma Blackwood. Her grandfather was Colonel Blackwood and her father was Captain Blackwood. She says she might know something about the landing gear problem. She's asking to speak with you." Morrison's hands froze on the controls as he processed the name, remembering stories he had heard about the Blackwoods, about their legendary skills and knowledge. He made a decision that defied standard operating procedure, but honored something deeper. "Send her up." Emma walked into the cockpit and was immediately struck by how small it seemed, how many warnings were flashing, how tense both pilots looked. Morrison glanced back at her. "Emma Blackwood." She nodded. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I heard about the landing gear. My dad taught me about manual gear extension on his aircraft. Sometimes when backup systems won't lock the gear, there's mechanical interference from the doors. If you do a series of sharp turns while the gear is down, sometimes the aerodynamic forces plus the momentum will shake it into place. He called it the shake and lock procedure. I don't know if it works on this plane, but it might be worth trying." Morrison and Hayes exchanged glances, both of them recognizing that what this 12-year-old was describing matched advanced troubleshooting that wasn't in their emergency procedures, but that experienced military pilots sometimes used. Morrison made his decision. "Rescue 15, United 2847. We're going to attempt aggressive maneuvering to try to shake our landing gear into place. Stand by for visual confirmation." Chen acknowledged, positioning his Black Hawk for better observation. Morrison then rolled the aircraft into a series of controlled but sharp turns, left then right, the massive airliner banking more steeply than passengers had ever experienced, the stress on the airframe and the partially extended gear creating forces that might either lock it or tear it off completely. In the Black Hawk, Chen watched as the airliner maneuvered and the landing gear swung with the forces, saw it extend further, then suddenly snap into what looked like the locked position. "United 2847. Your left main gear just extended fully and appears locked. Repeat, your gear appears locked." In the cockpit, Morrison and Hayes saw their indicator lights change from red to green as the gear locked into place. Morrison felt a surge of relief so powerful he had to remind himself to breathe. He looked back at Emma. "How did you know that might work?" She smiled slightly, tears on her cheeks. My dad used to say that sometimes the best procedures are the ones mechanics and pilots figure out together after years of dealing with stubborn equipment. He said understanding how things work mechanically is just as important as following the book. Morrison reached back and gently touched her shoulder. Your father taught you well. You may have just saved everyone on this plane. Thank you, Emma Blackwood. He directed her back to her seat, and Emma returned through the cabin, where passengers who had felt the violent maneuvering were looking frightened and confused. Sarah helped her back into 14C and buckled her in, then made an announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, that maneuvering was deliberate and necessary to correct the landing gear problem. Thanks to some quick thinking, our gear is now locked, and we're preparing for landing. We're going to be okay. She didn't mention that the quick thinking had come from a 12-year-old, but somehow word spread through whispers that the kid in 14C had gone to the cockpit and helped fix something. Morrison flew the final approach to Wichita with hands that were steadier now that he had all 3 landing gear confirmed down and locked. The Black Hawks flanked him on both sides, Chen and Price providing continuous visual confirmation and moral support that meant more than any manual could capture. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles lined the runway, ready for disaster but hoping for success. Morrison crossed the threshold with his crippled aircraft barely responding to controls, set it down on the runway with a firmness that came from having minimal hydraulics, and felt all 3 gear take the weight without collapsing. The aircraft rolled down the runway trailing foam from fire suppression systems, slowed under emergency braking, and finally stopped 4,000 feet from the threshold. The cabin erupted in applause and tears as passengers realized they were down safely. Morrison sat in his seat, feeling exhaustion wash over him, then picked up the PA. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Wichita. Thanks to some incredible teamwork, military assistance, and the bravery of a very special young passenger, we're all home safe. The passengers cheered again, many of them looking toward Emma Blackwood, who sat quietly in 14C with tears running down her face, crying not from fear, but from the release of tension and the thought that maybe her grandfather and father had somehow been watching over them all. The Black Hawks landed at Wichita shortly after the airliner, and Major Chen was the first one off his aircraft, moving toward the terminal where passengers were being evacuated down emergency slides. He found the airline personnel and asked specifically for Emma Blackwood, needing to see with his own eyes the girl who carried such a legendary name. When they brought her to him, escorted by Sarah, who had refused to leave her side, Chen snapped to attention and saluted her with a precision that made other military personnel in the area immediately do the same. Miss Blackwood, he said formally, on behalf of the United States military and everyone who knew your grandfather and father, we are honored to have been able to assist you today. They would be incredibly proud of your courage and your quick thinking. Emma returned the salute the way her grandfather had taught her when she was 6 years old, standing straight and holding it properly before dropping her hand. Thank you for coming to help us, sir. My grandfather always said the military takes care of its own and the families of those who served. Thank you for proving him right. Chen felt his throat tighten at her words, at the maturity and grace in someone so young who had already endured so much loss. Other military personnel gathered around. Black Hawk crew members, Air Force personnel from the base, even submariners who had been training nearby and heard what happened. They all wanted to meet Emma Blackwood, to shake her hand, to tell her they remembered her grandfather and father, to assure her she would never be alone as long as warriors drew breath. Lieutenant Colonel Price approached with her flight medic, both of them having heard the story of what Emma had suggested in the cockpit. I flew with your father once, Price said quietly. Medical evacuation mission out of Bagram. He was the best pilot I ever saw and one of the bravest men I ever knew. When I heard your name on that passenger manifest, I knew we would do whatever it took to bring you home safe. And then I heard you went into the cockpit and solved the landing gear problem yourself. You're every bit Blackwood, and that makes your family to all of us. The airline had arranged for Emma's grandmother to be patched through on a phone call while they waited for her rebooked flight to San Diego. When Emma heard her grandmother's voice, she finally broke down completely, sobbing as she told her about the emergency, about the Black Hawks, about going to the cockpit, about the military personnel saluting her and saying her name with such respect. Her grandmother, a woman who had buried her husband and her son but remained strong for the granddaughter who was all she had left, cried with her and told her that both the men they loved were surely watching and smiling at how brave she had been. Morrison and Hayes came to find Emma before she left the airport, both pilots needing to thank her personally for what she had contributed to saving their aircraft and everyone aboard. Morrison knelt down to her eye level. "Emma, in all my years of flying, I've never had a passenger help solve an emergency like you did today. Your knowledge and your courage made the difference. Your father obviously taught you well, and I hope you know that his legacy lives on in you." Hayes hugged her, no longer the professional first officer but simply a person grateful to be alive. "You're an amazing young woman, Emma Blackwood. Don't ever forget that." The passengers from Flight 2847 had heard by now who the quiet girl in 14C actually was, and many of them came to speak with her before their connecting flights. The businessman from 14A, who had barely noticed her during boarding, shook her hand with eyes that showed new respect. "I had no idea who you were or what you've been through. Thank you for being brave when we needed it." The elderly couple from across the aisle hugged her and told her they would pray for her and her grandmother. Person after person thanked her, many of them with tears, all of them seeing her now not as just another kid, but as someone who had proven that courage and knowledge had no age requirement. The news media got wind of the story, how a 12-year-old girl had helped save a crippled airliner, how military helicopters had responded with special priority when they learned a Blackwood was aboard, how her family's legacy of sacrifice had been honored by warriors who scrambled to protect her. Reporters wanted interviews, but the military personnel formed a protective barrier around Emma, making sure she was shielded from cameras and questions until her grandmother could be there with her. Major Chen personally escorted her to her rebooked flight, walking beside her through the terminal, where pilots and flight attendants stopped to shake her hand and thank her for representing the best of what aviation families could be. When Emma finally boarded the new flight to San Diego, the captain came back to speak with her personally, telling her it was an honor to have her aboard and that the entire crew had heard what happened. They upgraded her to first class despite the airline's normal policies about unaccompanied minors, wanting her to be comfortable and safe. The flight attendants treated her with a respect that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with recognizing someone who had earned it through grace under pressure. And when other passengers learned who she was, they applauded as she walked to her seat, a standing ovation for a 12-year-old who had proven worthy of a legendary name. The flight to San Diego was smooth and uneventful, giving Emma time to process everything that had happened. She thought about her grandfather, who had taught her about helicopters and had told her stories about staying calm in combat. She thought about her father, who had taught her about fixed-wing aircraft and had shown her that knowledge could save lives. She thought about how their names had been spoken with such reverence by the Black Hawk pilots, how military personnel had saluted her, how she had been able to help in a moment of crisis because they had prepared her without even knowing they were doing it. And she understood that carrying the name Blackwood meant more than bearing grief and loss. It meant carrying forward their legacy of courage, knowledge, and service. When the flight landed in San Diego, Emma saw her grandmother waiting at the gate, looking older and more fragile than when they had last been together, but with eyes that blazed with pride and love. They held each other for a long time, both of them crying, both of them grateful to be together again. Her grandmother pulled back and looked at her carefully. "I heard what you did, sweetheart. I heard how you helped save that airplane and how the military honored your grandfather's and father's names. They're both watching over you, and they're so proud." Emma nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in her throat. "I tried to be brave like they taught me, Grandma. I tried to stay calm and help when I could." Her grandmother smiled through her tears. "That's all anyone can ever do, Emma, and you did it perfectly. You're a Blackwood, and that means when others panic, you think. When others run, you stay. When others give up, you find a way. You showed everyone today what that name means." They walked through the airport together, Emma carrying her backpack with its colorful pins, looking once again like an ordinary kid, except for the way military personnel in the terminal straightened and nodded respectfully when they saw her pass. Word had spread even here about what had happened in Wichita, about the Blackwood girl who had helped save Flight 2847. In the days that followed, Emma received letters from pilots and crew members who had been on the flight, from passengers who wanted to thank her properly, from military personnel who had known her grandfather or father and wanted her to know their sacrifices would never be forgotten. She received a commendation from the airline recognizing her contribution to the successful emergency landing, written in language that acknowledged her age but honored her actions. She received a letter from Major Chen and the Black Hawk crews, written on official military stationery, expressing their honor at having been able to assist her and their admiration for how she had conducted herself. But perhaps the most meaningful communication came from the Pilots Association, an organization representing military aviators from all service branches. They sent her a formal letter informing her that she had been made an honorary member in recognition of her family's legacy and her own demonstration of airmanship and courage. The letter explained that while she was too young to fly aircraft herself, she had proven she understood the most important principles that made great pilots: stay calm, think clearly, use knowledge to solve problems, and never give up when lives depend on you. They told her that whenever she was old enough, if she chose to pursue aviation, she would have mentors and supporters throughout the military community ready to help her follow in her grandfather's and father's footsteps. Emma kept that letter in a special box along with the folded flags from Arlington, the medals her grandfather and father had earned, and the photographs of them in their flight suits standing beside their aircraft. Sometimes, late at night, when she missed them so much it hurt, she would take out the letter and read it again, remembering how the Black Hawks had spoken her name with such reverence, how military personnel had saluted her, how she had been able to help save 187 people because two men had loved her enough to teach her everything they knew about flying and courage and staying calm when the world was falling apart around her. She was just a kid, 12 years old, with a backpack full of school books and a future full of possibilities. But she was also Emma Blackwood, granddaughter and daughter of heroes, carrier of a name that would always command respect from those who understood what true sacrifice meant. And on a Saturday afternoon over Kansas, when a crippled airliner needed help, when Black Hawk helicopters scrambled to assist, when military communications revealed her legendary name, she had proven that some identities transcend age, that courage knows no minimum height requirement, and that the legacy of heroes lives on in the children they leave behind, who remember their lessons and honor their memories by being brave when others need it most. The story of Flight 2847 became part of aviation history, taught in safety courses as an example of successful emergency management and crew resource management. But it also became part of military lore, told in ready rooms and training squadrons as the story of how Emma Blackwood, at 12 years old, had lived up to a name that warriors spoke with reverence. And somewhere in the place where heroes go when their service is complete, a colonel and a captain who had given everything to protect others watched their granddaughter and daughter carry their legacy forward, and knew that the name Blackwood would continue to mean courage, knowledge, and grace under pressure for as long as anyone remembered what it meant to serve something greater than yourself.